You know, there are some stories that stay with you long after you hear them. Stories that remind us how quickly things can change, how easily we can misjudge, and how powerful the truth really is. This is one of those stories. It happened in a small town called Meadowbrook, nestled in the heartland of America, where everyone knew everyone, and faith was the thread that held the community together. Now, Meadowbrook wasn't just any town. It was the kind of place where church bells marked the rhythm of daily life, where Sunday mornings saw families walking together to St. Catherine's Church, dressed in their best clothes, ready to worship and connect with their neighbors. For nearly 40 years, these good people had been led by Father Thomas, a gentle soul with silver hair and a voice that could soothe any troubled heart. He knew every family, every struggle, every joy. He had baptized their children, married their sons and daughters, and laid their loved ones to rest. Father Thomas wasn't just their priest. He was family. So you can imagine the uncertainty that rippled through Meadowbrook when Father Thomas announced his retirement. People didn't know what to expect. Change is hard, especially when it involves something as personal and sacred as faith. And when they heard that his replacement would be a 35-year-old American priest named Father Michael, well, let's just say the skepticism was real. Father Michael arrived on a warm summer afternoon with nothing but two suitcases and a heart full of hope. He was young, energetic, and had an impressive background that included theological studies in Rome. But impressive credentials don't always translate to acceptance in a tight-knit community like Meadowbrook. The townspeople looked at him with cautious eyes, wondering if this outsider could ever truly understand them, their traditions, their way of life. The first few weeks were challenging. Father Michael could feel the distance, the polite but guarded interactions after Mass, the way conversations would pause when he entered a room. It would have been easy to become discouraged, to simply go through the motions and wait for acceptance to come naturally. But Father Michael wasn't that kind of man. He understood that trust had to be earned, not demanded. So he rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Not the kind of work you do from behind a desk, but the kind that gets your hands dirty and your heart involved. He started visiting people in their homes. Not quick, obligatory visits, but real meaningful time spent with his parishioners. He sat with Mrs. Henderson, who had just lost her husband of 50 years, and simply listened as she shared memories and tears. He helped the Garcia family repair their fence after a storm, working alongside them in the hot sun. He showed up at the hospital at 2 in the morning when young Tommy Patterson had an accident, staying with the frightened parents until they knew their son would be okay. But Father Michael didn't stop there. He looked around Meadowbrook and saw needs that weren't being met. He saw families struggling to put food on the table, children without warm clothes for winter, homeless people in nearby cities who needed help. So he organized food drives, coordinated clothing donations, and encouraged his congregation to see their faith not just as something you practice on Sunday mornings, but as something you live every single day. And then there were his sermons. Oh, his sermons. Father Michael had a gift, you see. He could take ancient scriptures, stories written thousands of years ago, and make them feel like they were written yesterday just for you. He would stand at the pulpit, not reading stiffly from notes, but speaking from his heart, weaving in personal stories, moments of humor, and profound truths that made people think differently about their lives. He talked about kindness in a world that often felt cruel. He talked about forgiveness when holding grudges seemed easier. He talked about compassion when judging others had become second nature. And people listened, really listened. His messages weren't just words that floated away the moment you stepped outside. They stuck with you, challenged you, changed you. Word began to spread beyond Meadowbrook. People from neighboring towns started showing up on Sunday mornings, curious about this dynamic young priest they had heard so much about. Pews that had been half empty for years suddenly filled up again. There was an energy in St. Catherine's Church that hadn't been there in a long time. Father Michael wasn't trying to replace Father Thomas or erase the past. He was breathing new life into something beautiful that had always been there, just waiting to be rekindled. As the months passed, something wonderful happened. The skepticism melted away. The cautious distance closed. Even the most resistant members of the congregation found themselves warming to Father Michael. They saw that his commitment was genuine, that his modern approach wasn't a threat to their traditions, but a way of making those traditions relevant and vibrant for a new generation. Father Michael became part of the fabric of Meadowbrook. You'd see him on the sidelines of youth soccer games, cheering louder than any parent. He'd show up at community potlucks with a dish he'd attempted to cook himself, laughing when people joked about his culinary skills. He attended town council meetings, took interest in local history, and incorporated Meadowbrook's unique traditions into his celebrations. This wasn't just a job to him, this was home. Among all the people who came to love and respect Father Michael, there was one woman who stood out. Her name was Eleanor, and if you wanted to understand what true devotion looked like, you only had to watch her. Eleanor was a widow in her late 60s, a woman whose husband had passed away several years earlier, leaving a hole in her life that she'd filled with faith and service. Eleanor was always at the church, always. Whether it was early morning or late evening, you could count on finding her there, doing something for someone. She cleaned the sanctuary until it sparkled, arranged flowers on the altar with an artist's eye, and prepared for every celebration and event with meticulous care. But her service didn't stop at the church doors. Eleanor had a gift for seeing people who were hurting, lonely, or in need. She'd show up at the homes of the sick and elderly with home-cooked meals, still warm from her oven. She'd sit with people who had no one else, listening to their stories, holding their hands, reminding them they weren't forgotten. Her kindness didn't discriminate. It didn't matter what church you attended or whether you attended any church at all. If you needed help, Eleanor was there. The whole community admired her. Children loved her like a grandmother. Young people looked to her as an example of how to live with purpose. Other parishioners felt inspired to serve more, give more, do more, simply because Eleanor showed them what was possible when you truly lived your faith instead of just talking about it. Father Michael saw in Eleanor the living embodiment of everything he preached. She didn't need sermons to tell her how to be kind or compassionate or generous. She just was. And in many ways, she taught him as much as he taught her. Then came that autumn morning. It started like so many others. The 7 o'clock Mass, early enough that the sky was still holding on to the last whispers of dawn. Eleanor attended faithfully, as she always did, finding peace in those quiet morning prayers when the world outside was just beginning to stir. But on this particular morning, after Mass ended and the other parishioners filed out into the cool morning air, Eleanor decided to stay. The sanctuary looked especially beautiful that morning. The newly renovated altar gleamed in the golden light filtering through the stained glass windows, creating patterns of color that danced across the walls and floor. It was breathtaking, really, a moment of such perfect peace and beauty that Eleanor felt compelled to share it. She pulled out her phone, something she didn't do often, and set it up to live stream the view. She wanted her friends, her fellow parishioners who couldn't be there, to experience this moment of tranquility. As the live stream began, Eleanor knelt in prayer, her heart full of gratitude for this community, this church, this life of service that gave her such purpose. And then, without warning, everything changed. Eleanor felt a sudden crushing sensation in her chest. Her heart began racing, pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. She couldn't catch her breath. Each attempt to draw air felt like trying to breathe through a straw. Eleanor had seen enough in her years to know exactly what was happening. She was having a heart attack. She tried to call out, tried to scream for help, but her voice came out as nothing more than a whisper, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the sanctuary. The pain intensified, radiating down her arm, up into her jaw. She clutched at her chest, her face contorting in agony, and then her legs gave way and Eleanor collapsed onto the cold stone floor. Her phone slipped from her grasp, clattering beside her, but the live stream didn't stop. It kept recording, kept broadcasting, capturing everything that was about to unfold. Eleanor lay there, barely conscious, barely breathing, as the golden morning light continued to stream through those beautiful stained glass windows, indifferent to the crisis happening below. In the sacristy, Father Michael heard something, a sound that didn't belong, a thud followed by silence. His instincts kicked in immediately, and he rushed toward the sanctuary, his heart already beginning to race with worry. What he saw when he entered made his blood run cold. Eleanor, dear, faithful Eleanor, lay motionless on the floor, her face pale, her lips turning blue. Father Michael didn't hesitate. Years of emergency training took over. He dropped to his knees beside her, checking for a pulse, for breathing, for any sign of life. It was there, but barely, fading with each passing second. He began CPR immediately, his hands positioned over her chest, beginning the rhythmic compressions that might, just might, keep her alive until help could arrive. As his body worked on autopilot, counting compressions, delivering rescue breaths, his lips moved in desperate prayer. Please, God, please don't let her die. Not here, not now, not like this. He was so focused, so completely absorbed in the task of saving Eleanor's life that he didn't hear the side door of the church open. He didn't notice the sacristan and several parish ladies entering, fresh from their work in the gardens. And he certainly didn't see the horrified expressions on their faces when they caught just a glimpse of him running from where Eleanor lay, seeking help, seeking the holy oils, seeking anything that might save her. In that split second, without understanding the full picture, without asking a single question, they saw something that wasn't there. And what they thought they saw would change everything. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a lie. It's a truth seen from the wrong angle, a story told with missing pieces, a moment misunderstood. And in that church on that autumn morning, a terrible misunderstanding was about to unfold that would shake Meadowbrook to its very core. The sacristan, a man named Robert who had served St. Catherine's for over 20 years, stood frozen in the doorway. His mind was trying to make sense of what his eyes had just seen. There was Eleanor lying motionless on the floor, and there was Father Michael running away from her body. In Robert's panicked mind, there was only one explanation, and it was horrifying. The women with him gasped, their hands flying to their mouths. They didn't stop to think. They didn't call out to ask what had happened. Fear and shock took over, and in that moment of chaos, they made a terrible assumption. Something awful had happened to Eleanor, and Father Michael was responsible. Robert's hands were shaking and he ran to the bell tower. His heart pounded in his chest as he grabbed the rope and began to pull. The church bells, which usually rang out in celebration or to call people to worship, now clanged out an alarm that echoed through the streets of Meadowbrook. It was a sound that didn't belong on a peaceful Tuesday morning, a sound that meant emergency, danger, crisis. All across town, people stopped what they were doing. Mothers looked up from making breakfast. Shop owners stepped out onto the sidewalk. Children paused on their way to school. Everyone in Meadowbrook knew what those bells meant when they rang like that, urgent and insistent, outside of their normal schedule. Something was very, very wrong. Within minutes, people began rushing toward St. Catherine's Church. Some ran, some drove, all of them filled with worry and confusion. What could have happened? Was there a fire? An accident? As they arrived, they found Robert and the women outside, pale and shaken, struggling to find words to explain what they'd seen. "It's Father Michael," Robert finally managed to say, his voice breaking. Eleanor is inside. She's hurt. We saw him. We saw him running from her." The words spread through the growing crowd like poison. Whispers became voices, voices became shouts. Eleanor, their beloved Eleanor, had been hurt, and their priest, the man they had come to trust and admire, was somehow involved. The implications were too terrible to fully grasp, but the crowd's mind was already made up. You have to understand something about fear and anger. When they mix together in a crowd, they create something dangerous, something that doesn't think clearly, doesn't ask questions, doesn't pause for truth. The mob mentality took hold of Meadowbrook that morning, and it was ugly to witness. By the time the local police arrived, sirens wailing, there were dozens of people gathered outside the church. The mood was hostile, aggressive. People who had praised Father Michael just days ago, who had sat in his pews and nodded along to his sermons about forgiveness and compassion, were now calling for justice, for answers, for punishment. When Father Michael finally emerged from the church, his face was streaked with tears, his shirt disheveled from performing sap, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline and fear of trying to save a life. He looked at the crowd, at all these faces he had come to know and love, And he saw something that broke his heart even more than Eleanor's collapse. He saw suspicion, accusation, hatred. Please, he said, his voice hoarse and desperate. Please, you have to listen. Eleanor had a heart attack. I was trying to save her. I was doing CPR. I was trying to help her. But his words were drowned out by the angry voices of the crowd. They didn't want to hear explanations. They had already decided what had happened, had already written the story in their minds, and nothing Father Michael said was going to change it. Liar, someone shouted from the back. How could you? Screamed another voice. She trusted you. We trusted you, came another cry, and this one seemed to hurt Father Michael more than all the others combined. The police officers tried to maintain order, tried to create space between Father Michael and the increasingly hostile crowd, but it was like trying to hold back a flood with your bare hands. The situation was spiraling out of control. Parents were pulling their children back, worried that violence might erupt at any moment. Some people were crying. Others were shouting for Father Michael to be arrested immediately. One woman who had brought her sick mother to Father Michael just weeks earlier, when he had prayed with them and brought them comfort, now looked at him with disgust. I let you into my home, she said, her voice shaking. I trusted you with my mother. Father Michael stood there, surrounded by people who had become like family to him, and felt more alone than he had ever felt in his entire life. Everything he had built, every connection he had made, every bridge he had carefully constructed over these months was crumbling around him. His reputation, his ministry, his entire life's work, destroyed in minutes by a misunderstanding he couldn't seem to make anyone understand. The police officers were asking questions, trying to piece together what had happened. But the crowd's testimony was damning. They had seen him running. Eleanor was hurt. What other explanation could there be? But here's the thing about truth. Sometimes when everyone has stopped looking for it, when everyone has already made up their minds, truth finds a way to reveal itself anyway. And in this case, truth was still broadcasting live on social media, waiting for someone to pay attention. Inside the church, Eleanor's phone lay on the floor where it had fallen, its camera still pointing upward, still streaming everything to her social media account. The live stream had captured it all. Eleanor's collapse, Father Michael's immediate response, his desperate CPR efforts, his prayers, his fear, his heroism. Every single second of truth was right there, being watched by people who hadn't rushed to the church, people who were still at home, scrolling through their phones on a quiet Tuesday morning. One of those people was a young man named Daniel. He was 23, worked at the local hardware store, and had always admired Eleanor's kindness. He had been watching her live stream that morning while having breakfast, appreciating the beautiful view of the altar she was sharing. And then he had watched in horror as everything went wrong. Unlike the crowd at the church, Daniel had seen everything. He had seen Eleanor collapse. He had seen Father Michael rush to help her. He had watched the priest perform CPR with skill and desperation, trying everything in his power to keep her alive. There was no attack, no violence, just a medical emergency and a man doing his absolute best to prevent a tragedy. Daniel grabbed his phone and ran. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life, his heart pounding, knowing that something terrible was happening based on those church bells, knowing that he had the truth in his hands and he had to get there before it was too late. He arrived at the church to find chaos. The crowd was pressing forward. The police were barely maintaining control, and Father Michael looked like a man who had lost everything. Daniel pushed through the people, shouting, "Wait, wait, I have video. I have the truth." At first, no one heard him. The noise was too loud, the emotions too high. But Daniel kept pushing, kept shouting, until finally he reached the police officers. "Please," he gasped, out of breath. "Please, you have to see this." Eleanor's phone was streaming. "I watched the whole thing. Father Michael didn't hurt her. He was saving her life." One of the officers, a woman named Martinez who had known Meadowbrook her whole life, took Daniel's phone. She held up her hand, calling for silence, and the crowd gradually quieted, curious about what was happening. She pressed play on the video, and suddenly the truth began to speak for itself. There was Eleanor, kneeling in prayer, the camera showing the beautiful altar she had wanted to share. And then, her face changing, the pain hitting her, the collapse, the phone falling but still recording. And then Father Michael rushing in, his face filled with concern and fear. His hands immediately going to check her pulse, his body moving into position to begin CPR, his lips moving in prayer as he worked to save her life. The video showed everything. His competent chest compressions, his rescue breaths, his desperate search for the holy oils to administer last rites, the sweat on his brow, the tears in his eyes, the absolute undeniable truth that this man had done nothing wrong. He had done everything right. Officer Martinez looked up from the phone, her own eyes now wet with tears. She looked at the crowd and in a loud, clear voice she said, "Father Michael didn't hurt Eleanor. He tried to save her life. This video proves it." She held up the phone so others could see. People crowded around watching the small screen, and as they watched, you could see the change happening. Faces that had been twisted with anger began to crumble with shame. Eyes that had been hard with accusation now filled with tears of remorse. The terrible realization of what they had done, what they had almost done, washed over Meadowbrook like a cold wave. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the silence of a community confronting its own worst instincts. The silence of people realizing they had become the very thing they claimed to stand against. They had judged without evidence. They had condemned without trial. They had turned on an innocent man who had devoted himself to serving them. One by one, people began to approach Father Michael. Some couldn't even look him in the eye. They came with heads bowed, with tears streaming down their faces, with voices choked by shame and regret. "Father, I'm so sorry," said the woman who had accused him of violating her trust. "I don't know what I was thinking. Please, please forgive me." "We were wrong," said Robert, the sacristan who had rung the bells. "So terribly wrong. I should have checked. I should have asked. I should have trusted you." Father Michael stood there, still shaking from the trauma of the last hour, still exhausted from trying to save Eleanor's life, still heartbroken from being accused by people he loved. Every part of him had to be screaming with hurt and anger and betrayal. He would have been justified in turning away, in refusing their apologies, in letting them live with the weight of what they had done. But you know what he did instead? He forgave them. Right there in that moment, with genuine grace and compassion in his voice, he said, "I forgive you, all of you. We all make mistakes when we're scared. We all jump to conclusions sometimes. What matters is that we learn from this, that we do better next time." And in that moment, Meadowbrook learned something profound about the man they had almost destroyed. They learned that he truly believed everything he preached, that his faith wasn't just words from a pulpit, but a way of living, even when it was hard, even when it hurt. The ambulance arrived and took Eleanor to the hospital. Father Michael insisted on going with her, holding her hand as they loaded her into the vehicle. The crowd watched them go, still processing everything that had happened, still trying to understand how they had gotten it so wrong. In the days that followed, Meadowbrook went through a collective reckoning. People talked about what had happened, examined their own reactions, and asked themselves hard questions about judgment and trust in truth. The incident became a teaching moment, not just for the congregation, but for the entire community. Father Michael didn't hold grudges. He continued his ministry with the same dedication and love as before, but he also didn't shy away from using what had happened as a lesson. His sermons touched on the dangers of assumptions, the importance of seeking truth before judgment, and the power of forgiveness to heal even the deepest wounds. And Eleanor survived. After weeks in the hospital, she came home to a community that had learned something valuable because of what had happened to her. She returned to her work at the church, to her visits with the sick and lonely, to her life of service. And she did it all with that same gentle smile, never once blaming anyone for what had transpired. The story of that autumn morning became part of Meadowbrook's history. Not a story they told with pride, but one they told with humility. It became a reminder that truth matters. And so that judgment without evidence is dangerous, and that forgiveness and grace can heal even the deepest divisions. Father Michael stayed in Meadowbrook for many years after that, and the bond between him and his congregation was actually stronger for having been tested and survived. They had learned together, grown together, and emerged as better people on the other side. Because sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones we need most. And sometimes the truth isn't just about what happened, but about what we choose to do after we discover we were wrong. That's the real story of Meadowbrook. Not about a misunderstanding, but about a community that learned to be better, to do better, and to hold on to truth even when fear tries to pull them away from it.